vehicles of War Thunder. This is actually going to be a bit of a longer episode because there's actually quite a bit to say about the vehicle that we are covering here. In this episode, we are going to be covering a jet for the first time, and what better jet to start with than the iconic North American Aviation F-86 Sabre? None is, of course, the correct answer. The first thing, I can't talk about the Canadair, K variants, and missile variants that are in the German, French, Italian, and Japanese/Chinese trees respectively, because I don't have them unlocked, and it would likely be about another year before I get around to actually grinding those vehicles out. And of course, that assumes I'm still playing War Thunder in a year, and there's no guarantee of that. So if I ever get around to unlocking those variants, I will cover them in an addendum type video, similar to what I did with the Hawk 75. Admittedly, that one is largely my fault. I didn't pay attention to what was in the tech tree. Like I said, when I get around to unlocking those, there will be some sort of addendum type video to cover those. Potentially one for the different categories there, we'll see. It just depends. Either way. Most of the footage you'll be seeing in the background is replay footage because I was not actually recording when I played those matches. I wasn't exactly planning to cover the F-86 at the time, but then I had some pretty decent matches, in my opinion, and so I decided to go back and record the replays of them. Some of them are going to be somewhat stuttery, because as I mentioned in the last video, at the time, there was a bit of an issue with OBS and using any of the GPU encoding options for AMD graphics cards. That has since been fixed, so some of it might still be a little bit stuttery when it comes to more recently recorded footage after the issue got resolved. But it should be significantly less stuttery than some of the footage that was recorded previously using CPU encoding methods, which don't work particularly well with War Thunder for some reason. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the history. By late 1944, North American had proposed their first jet fighter to the United States Navy. This would result in the FJ-1 Fury, which was an unexceptional transitional jet fighter that used a straight-wing design that was derived from North American's P-51. In mid-1944, designs were being drafted for a medium-range, single-seat, high-altitude, jet-powered day escort fighter/fighter bomber for the United States Army Air Force. 4 designs were submitted by North American Aviation in early 1945, and the U.S. Army Air Force selected one design over the others and granted North American a contract to build 3 examples of what was called the XP-86, XP for Experimental Pursuit. This design was roughly based off of the FJ-1 Fury, with some of the requirements needed by the Navy being removed and some other modifications being completed, allowing the XP-86 to be lighter and faster than the Fury, with an estimated top speed of 937 kilometers an hour, or 582 miles an hour, versus the Fury's 880 kilometers an hour, or 547 miles per hour. However, even with this increase in speed in early studies, it was revealed that the XP-86 would have the same performance as its rivals, the XP-80 and XP-84. These other designs were also further along in the development stages, so it was feared that the XP-86 would be cancelled. The main issue for the XP-86 was that it could not reach the required top speed of 970 kilometers an hour, or 600 miles per hour. To deal with this, North American had to devise a radical change to leapfrog their rivals. Coincidentally, around this time, Operation Paperclip was taking place, which came with it data from German aerodynamicists. This showed that a swept wing could greatly reduce drag and delay compressibility problems that had plagued aircraft as they approached the speed of sound. This data showed that by 1944, German engineers and designers had established the benefits of swept wings based on experimental designs dating back to 1940. And a study of this data showed that a swept-wing design would solve their speed problem with a slat on the leading edge of the wing that extended at low speeds to enhance low-speed stability. However, because of how far along the development of the XP-86 was, there was a push by senior staff at North American to the idea of changing, or there was pushback by senior staff at North American to the idea of changing the wing design. After obtaining good results in wind tunnel tests, however, the opposition relented and the swept-wing design was adopted. To meet the necessary performance requirements, it was decided to use a 35-degree swept-back wing with an automatic slat, like that based on the Messerschmitt's Me-262, and an electrically adjustable stabilizer, another feature of the Me-262. The XP-86 prototype was rolled out on August 8, 1947. Its first flight occurred on October 1, 1947, with George Welsh at the controls flying from Muroc Dry Lake, now Edwards Air Force Base in California. The United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command had F-86 Sabres in service from 1949 through 1950. They were assigned to the 22nd Bomb Wing, the 1st Fighter Wing, and the 1st Fighter Interceptor Wing. The F-86 was the primary U.S. air combat fighter during the Korean War, with a significant number of the first 3 production models seeing combat. The F-86 was also produced under license by Canadair Ltd. as the Canadair Sabre. The F-86A set its first official speed record of 1,080 kilometers an hour on September 15, 1948 at Muroc Dry Lake, flown by Major Richard L. Johnson. 5 years later, on May 18, 1953, Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to break the sound barrier, flying a Canadian-built F-86 Mark III alongside Chuck Yeager. Now, let's talk some general specs about the F-86. The F-86 was produced as both a fighter interceptor and a fighter bomber. Several variants were introduced over its production life, with improvements and different armaments implemented. The prototype, the XP-86, was fitted with a General Electric J35 C3 jet engine that produced around 18 kilonewtons of thrust. This engine was built by GM's Chevrolet division until production was turned over to Allison. The F-86A1 used the General Electric J47 GE7 that produced 23 kilonewtons of thrust, with the F-86H further down the line using the General Electric J73 GE3 that produced 41 kilonewtons of thrust. The F-86H was a fighter-bomber version and could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, including an external fuel-type tank that could carry napalm. Unguided 70mm rockets were used on some fighters on training missions, but the 127mm rockets were later carried on combat operations. The F-86 could also be fitted with a pair of jettisonable jet fuel tanks, 4 on the F-86F beginning in 1953, that extended the range of the aircraft. Both the interceptor and fighter bomber versions carried 12.7mm M3 Browning machine guns with electrically boosted feed in the nose. Later versions of the F-86H, as well as a couple variants of the F-86F, carried 4 20mm cannons instead of machine guns. The Sabre's swept wings and jet engine produced a flying experience that was very different from the propeller-driven fighters of the time, which resulted in numerous accidents even for experienced fighter pilots. Additionally, the ongoing technical development and long production history of the F-86 resulted in significant differences in the handling and flying characteristics between the various models. Some important changes to the design include the switch from an elevator/stabilizer to an all-flying tail, the discontinuation of the leading edge slats for a solid leading edge with increased internal fuel capacity, increased engine power, and an internal rocket bay in the case of the F-86D. Each of these changes had an impact on the handling and flying characteristics of the F-86. Before we start talking variants, one thing that should be noted is that the designations of A, B, C, D, E, etc. are not necessarily in chronological order. Some changes are even so significant that the aircraft got a whole new designation. First up is the F-86A, of which 554 were built, comprising of the F-86A1 through to the A5. The F-86B had 188 units ordered as an upgraded model of the A model, with a wider fuselage and larger tires, but they were delivered as F-86A5s. The F-86C was the original designation for the YF-93A, which was to be a penetration fighter bomber escort. 2 were built, and an order for 118 was made, but that order was later canceled after promising results for the Boeing B-47 Stratojet project that resulted in an aircraft that was considered to be not needing an escort because it was such a good high-speed bomber. The F-86D Dog Sabre did not serve in Korea and was to be an all-weather interceptor and, for all intents and purposes, a bomber destroyer. The F-86D was equipped with an all-rocket armament and a ventral weapons tray that contained 24 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets. The pilot of the D was charged with the operation of the aircraft while manning the Advanced Hughes Aircraft Company Collision Course Radar Fire Control System. Mouthful of a name. With this fire control computer and radar, the aircraft could, in effect, literally quote-unquote, fly itself to a computed target's position. Once within 500 yards of said target, the aircraft would lower the retractable rocket tray and spray the target with the 24 Mighty Mouse rockets, with all actions handled automatically by the computer. This model would go on to, in many ways, inspire the F-86G, YF-86K, F-86K, and F-86L models. The F-86E was an improved version of the F-86A and it featured power-operated controls and an adjustable all-flying tail unit. 456 of the E1 through E5 models were built. The E10 and E15s were essentially the F-86F airframe with an F-86 engine. 60 of these were built by Canadair for the US Air Force as the F-86 E6. The F-86F was also an improved model, this time based on the F-86E. This model upgraded the engine and used a larger 6.3 wing, a fixed leading edge with a 6-inch extended chord at the root and a 3-inch extended chord at the tip, without leading edge slats. 2,239 were built of the F-86F series. This included the F-86 F1 through the F-15 models. A quick segue, the F2 variants within this block were equipped with 4 20mm T-160 cannons that had issues, where if fired in long bursts, the cannon gases could enter the engine intake and cause a compressor stall. During the gun valve project, as it was called, this would cause issues with pilots' engines going out, sometimes able to be restarted, and in one case causing a flame-out accident, followed by turbine failure resulting in the pilot needing to bail out. By the end of the project in 1953, a solution would be found in the form of a C-shaped plate that could dissipate the cannon gases so they wouldn't enter the engine intake. This solution, however, would not be adopted for operational use until the later variants of the F-86H that were equipped with 4 20mm M39 cannons, the name for the T-160 after being accepted as the next-generation air combat weapon by the US Air Force. Back to the build blocks, though. The first 2 orders of the 40 block of the F series comprised 280 aircraft that reverted to leading-edge wing slats of an improved design. 300 additional aircraft in the F series were assembled by Mitsubishi in Japan for the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. The F models had improved high-speed agility, coupled with a higher landing speed of over 233 kilometers an hour. The F-35 block had provisions for a new task, the nuclear tactical attack with one of the new small nukes, second-generation nuclear ordnance. The F-40 had a new slatted wing with a slightly higher span, resulting in a slight decrease in speed, but much better agility at both high and low speeds, and a reduced landing speed of 200 kilometers an hour. The US Air Force upgraded many previous F versions to the F-40 standard. 1E and 2Fs were also modified for improved performance via rocket boosters. The F-86H fighter bomber appeared after the armistice of the Korean War. Actual combat experience from the AE and F models was used to make the H, the quote-unquote perfect Sabre platform. The H was based on the airframe of the F, and was fitted with the Low Altitude Bombing System, or LABS for short, to fulfill its fighter bomber role classification. Production began in late 1953 and went on through August 1955. 473 units were produced. The first two arriving production units of the H model, however, were fitted with no armament whatsoever. Blocks 5 and 10 saw the implementation of 4 M39 20mm cannons, while Block 1, which was comprised of 113 aircraft, were fitted with the standard 6 12.7mm machine guns. Canadair of Canada handled licensed production of the Sabre. 6 variants of these licensed production models were built beginning with the Mark I. The Mark I effectively represented a prototype of the F-86A model. The Mark II followed with 350 units based on the F-86E. Deliveries of this initial production model were sent to the U.S. Air Force, Royal Air Force, and Canadian Air Force. A single Sabre Mark III model was built as a test platform for the Orenda turbojet engine. The Mark IV saw 438 units produced, only 10 served with the Royal Canadian Air Force, while 428 of these were delivered for the RAF, known in the RAF inventory as the Sabre F4. The Mark V was based on the F-86F model, but were fitted with the Orenda engine. 370 were built, with the bulk going to the Royal Canadian Air Force and 75 to the West German Luftwaffe. The Mark VI was the final production model for Canadair, to which 655 units were split between the Royal Canadian Air Force, the West German Luftwaffe, South Africa, and Colombia. Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation of Australia also produced the Sabre under license. 3 models were produced, which were known as the Mark 30, Mark 31, and Mark 32. 21 units of the Mark 30 were produced, and they featured the Avon 20 series engine and wing slats. The Mark 31 was also powered by the Avon engine and was fitted with the 6.3 wing and saw 21 units built. The Mark 32 production totaled 69 units built, and they featured the Avon 26 engine and 4 underwing pylons. The Avon-powered Sabres eventually found their way into the inventories of Malaysia and Indonesia after serving with the Royal Australian Air Force. The Sabre had an extensive and long-term global reach and was operated by Argentina, Australia, Bangladesh, Belgium, Bolivia, Burma, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Ethiopia, France, West Germany, Greece, Honduras, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, bought but never actually operated and were returned, according to my sources, Italy, Japan, Malaysia, Netherlands, Norway, Pakistan, Peru, Philippines, Portugal, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, the United Kingdoms, the United States, Venezuela, and Yugoslavia. Taiwan became one of the first foreign receivers of the Sabre, beginning in December 1954. Bolivia retired their F-86s as recently as 1994, according to my sources. As for the operational history of the Sabre, it served in the Korean War, having entered service in 1949. While earlier straight-wing jets such as the P-40 and F-84 initially achieved air victories, when the swept-wing MiG-15 was introduced in November of 1950, it outperformed all UN-based aircraft. In response, 3 squadrons of F-86s were rushed to the Far East in December. Early variants of the F-86 could not outturn, but they could outdive the MiG-15. The MiG-15 was superior to early F-86 models in ceiling, acceleration, rate of climb, and zoom. With the introduction of the F-86F in 1953, the 2 aircraft were more closely matched, with many combat-experienced pilots claiming marginal superiority for the F-86F. The heavier firepower of the MiG was addressed by fielding 8 F-86s armed with 20mm cannons in the waning months of the war. Despite being able to only fire 2 of the 4 20mm cannons at a time, the experiment was considered a success. The reason for this was just the sheer amount of pushback and cannon gases from firing all 4 cannons didn't exactly work out well for your aircraft. So pilots were generally limited to firing only 2 of the 4 at a time. In October 1951, the Soviets managed to recover a downed Sabre, and in their investigation of the type they concluded that the Sabre's advantage in combat was due to the APG-30 gun sight that facilitated accurate fire at longer ranges. This is not really represented in War Thunder unless you play simulator battles, so because I play realistic, it's completely irrelevant at the end of the day. The F-86 would also take part in the 1958 Taiwan Strait Crisis. In August 1958, the People's Republic of China tried to force the nationalists off the islands of Quemoy and Matsu, probably mispronounced that, by shelling and blockade. Nationalist F-86Fs flying combat air patrol over the islands found themselves confronted by communist MiG-15s and MiG-17s, and numerous dogfights resulted. During these battles, the nationalist Sabres would introduce a new element into aerial warfare. Under a secret effort designated Operation Black Magic, the United States Navy provided the Republic of China with the AIM-9 Sidewinder, its first infrared homing air-to-air missile, which was entering service with the United States military. A small team from VMF 323, a Marine FJ-4 Fury Squadron, with later assistance from the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake and North American Aviation, modified 20 of the nationalist Chinese Air Force's F-86 Sabres to carry a pair of Sidewinders on underwing launch rails, and instructed the ROC pilots in their use flying profiles with U.S. Air Force F-100s simulating the MiG-17. While the MiGs enjoyed an altitude advantage over the Sabre, just like they did in Korea, communist Chinese MiGs routinely cruised over the nationalist Sabres, only engaging when they had a favorable position. The Sidewinders, however, took away that advantage and proved to be devastatingly effective against the MiG. The Sabre also saw combat during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 and the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. These conflicts are, for all intents and purposes, a whole mess of he said, she said, so I won't talk about them too much except to say that even with the differences in claimed and acknowledged losses, the F-86 seemed to have performed decently against the Hunters, Vampires, Su-7s, and MiG-21s that were fielded by the Indian Air Force. This was probably helped in large part by the Pakistani F-86s being equipped with AIM-9B's Sidewinder missiles. The United States Air Force also used the F-86 as a stand-in for the MiG-17 during a tactics test called Project Feather Duster that was meant to help work out tactics that the F-100 and F-105 could use when they ran into a MiG-17. One pilot that took part in this project is said to have remarked, quote, "In any envelope except nose down and full throttle, the F-100 was inferior to the F-86H. The same was true with the F-105, which to me was actually a single-engine bomber." End quote. Now for how these aircraft actually perform in-game. Before talking about each variant, I want to go ahead and mention a general issue that, in my opinion, all of the Sabres, at least in the American tree, suffer from. And where necessary, I'll go into some more detail. All the Sabres in the American tree, in my experience, regularly face up tiers for many of their matches. This is particularly an issue in the case of the F2, and I'll go into more detail in a moment. Also, if matchmaking seems to cheat you like it does me, it seems like you usually get stuck with terrible teams that don't communicate, don't play to their vehicle's strengths, etc. But sometimes you'll get the odd team that curb stomps the enemy, leaving you with a boring match because you didn't really do anything. So your matches tend to be get ganked by a better vehicle, like one armed with missiles, and you may or may not, or that may or may not be a supersonic, or watch your teammates gank the enemy while you try to make it to the fight. Now, first let's talk about the A variant, specifically the A5. In my opinion, the A5 is not a particularly great, but also not exactly terrible aircraft necessarily. Largely, I would say it suffers from a case of it doesn't know what it wants to be. It doesn't know if it wants to be a more traditional jet gunfighter that largely relies on boom and zoom tactics, or if it wants to be a turn fighter because of the leading edge slats. It's also not a particularly quick vehicle when it comes to acceleration. particularly compared to later models of the F-86. It currently sits at an 8.3 battle rating in realistic battles, which means it can be up-tiered to 9.3, which results in it potentially facing supersonic aircraft such as the MiG-21 F-13 and MiG-21 PFM. Those are aircraft that you have basically no chance against unless the enemy pilot makes a major mistake. Starting at this BR, you also need to make sure you know how to dodge a missile, because quite a few aircraft within your search spread carry missiles, particularly more so compared to when you're flying in the battle rating of the F-80s and some of the earlier US jets. The guns on the A5 are exactly the same as those on the F-25, and they can be described as adequate. You have a decent amount of ammo at 1,800 rounds, which should be enough to net yourself 2 or 3 kills before you need to return to base anyway to get fuel. The A5, as mentioned earlier, doesn't seem to know if it wants to be a turn fighter or a B&Zer, and as a result, it doesn't seem to perform particularly well at either task, in my opinion. It's not great at either. It's not terrible at either. If you decide to turn fight, however, be warned that you will bleed speed as a result of the leading edge slats in particular. As a result, if you lose enough speed, you effectively become a sitting duck for anyone that's waiting on the outside of the furball that a lot of matches will often break down into if they're in any way an even match. Especially if you end up in a sustained turn fight, you really open yourself up to a vulture on the side, swooping in and just annihilating your aircraft. The F-25, in my opinion, is a much better aircraft compared to the A-5, with a better rate of climb. This can likely be largely attributed to the additional almost 400 kilogram force of the new engine. When I recorded the footage that you see in the background, both the A5 and F-25 sat at an 8.3 battle rating, but the F-25 has since gone up to an 8.7, which means it faces potential up tiers to 9.7, something it can actually somewhat reasonably get if my experience of flying the F2 is any indication when I have F-25s on my team at 9.7s. This means that you're going to face even more supersonic aircraft that are armed with cannons and missiles. If you still haven't learned how to avoid a missile without flares, you really should make sure you learn soon, because it's all downhill from here. The F2 sits at a higher 9.0 battle rating, and I can't say it's a particularly good aircraft. Not necessarily because it's a bad aircraft, but just because of the way Gaijin matchmaking works. First, my experience is that you will often get up tier to 9.7 and 10.0. Sometimes you'll get lucky and get a 9.3 up tier, which is doable, but then you get idiot teammates that don't use their vehicle to its strengths and don't communicate, and just a whole host of regular issues that War Thunder teammates tend to be. But when you get up tier to 9.7 and 10.0, you're basically fighting large portions of the enemy team being equipped with missiles, and a lot of those are also supersonics again, so you can't really run away. And if you run in a straight line, you're probably just going to get a missile up the ass. The F2 swaps out the 6 12.7mm machine guns for 4 20mm cannons. These cannons, without the gun upgrade, shotgun like crazy in my experience, and it doesn't improve significantly even with the upgrade, particularly if you fire all 4. I do notice that it seems almost like the shotgun effect is less if you only fire 2 of the cannons at a time, but that may just be because there's less lead flying down range. So I'm not 100% certain on that. You also don't carry a whole lot of ammo at only 460 rounds. If you fire all 4 cannons, you're going to likely only be able to get 1 or 2 kills at best. If you limit yourself to firing only two of the cannons at any given point in time, you have a slightly better chance of being able to get more kills, assuming you don't die early. But it might also, if you don't hit critical areas like the tail or wings and things like that, it might take you more ammo, relatively speaking, to be able to actually finish off the enemy that you're trying to hit. Because sadly, these 20mm don't seem to do nearly as devastating damage as some other cannons in the game. Also, in the case of the Sabre, I do generally recommend that you probably fly without any convergence on your guns. They're nose-mounted guns. I would probably just say your gun convergence to none, personally. I noticed that I seem to generally do better with gun convergence set to none compared to having it set to any actual value. That might just be me, it might be a fluke, but that's just something that I noticed. So it's something that I will recommend, but at the end of the day, that's entirely up to you. While you do have the option to carry some suspended ordnance with the F-86s, and it's the same ordnance for all of them, a handful of HVARs and 2 1,000-pound bombs. I have not actually used the Sabre, however, in ground realistic battles, and the reason for that is quite simply because I imagine it probably doesn't perform particularly well. Not because the suspended ordnance is lackluster, although admittedly it kind of is for killing anything other but the lightest of targets. If you take the HVARs and if you take the bombs, you get 1 kill, because both bombs drop at the same time, I believe. And so you get, unless you drop it into cluster, you're only going to get like 1 kill per life until you fly back to base, assuming you can make it back to base, because 8.0 tends to introduce a lot of radar-guided SPA, well, radar-assisted, I guess is a better way to describe it, SPAA in realistic battles, and so ground pounding actually becomes kind of a pain. In my opinion, right now, the Sabres largely suffer from a legacy issue. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, and by many, many years ago, I mean like maybe 2-3 years ago, the Sabre was generally considered to be the top dog jet. It would pretty easily kill just about anything it went up against, even MiGs, MiG-15s in particular. But nowadays, they often get up-tiered, and those up-tiers tend to be somewhat brutal for these aircraft, because they often can't really compete with things that are a full BR spread above their battle rating. And as a result of these aircraft being top dog back in the day, their repair costs are kind of extreme. The A is not terrible, but I assume that's largely because the A is a crappy Sabre in every sense. Its repair cost is not that extreme, and I believe it's only around about 10,000 or some odd Silver Lions, fully spaded. The F-25, however, fully spaded, cost 18,913 Silver Lions to repair. I would say it is possible to turn a profit on an individual match in the F-25, but you're gonna have to still actually be pretty decent in the aircraft, I think, to turn a profit. In the case of a fully spaded F2, it costs 22,966 Silver Lions to repair it. I think I only managed to turn a profit once, and that was in the one bit of F2 footage that you guys have seen or will see. Depends on exactly how I cut up the video. And that's largely just because I didn't die. Is about the only reason I was able to turn a profit there. Generally in the F2, I don't think I've ever turned a profit outside of like that match and maybe one other that I'm not remembering. So as a result, the F2 tends to be a aircraft that just bleeds your Silver Lions, in my opinion. And again, the F-25 is only marginally better, just because it's like a full 4,000 Silver Lions cheaper. Makes it a little bit more feasible, even if you don't have the best ever match, and kill 4 enemy aircraft and get the victory. But that's going to be it for this video. I will see you all next time, where we will be covering a French vehicle. Until next time, I want to go ahead and give a quick reminder that I do have a Discord, and that is my go-to place for posting about any changes to the channel regarding things like recording and streaming schedule. So I do recommend that you join that if you want to stay up to date on what's going on with the channel. I also have a Patreon and Streamlabs donation link down below if you wish to support the channel. That is, those two are some of the best ways to support the channel. Streamlabs is a little bit more so than Patreon, because I take home a larger cut via Streamlabs. But if you go Streamlabs, you don't get any of the bonus goodies of things like early access to videos and things like that. So that'll be it for this video. Until next time, fly safe, and if you're at a higher battle rating, basically anything 8.0 and up has the chance of fighting missiles at some point, make sure you keep an eye on your 6. Because if you don't, you might just take a missile up the ass. But until next time, goodbye and farewell.